All right. Good morning again, everybody. In 2006, a UPS employee named Peggy Young was told by her doctor not to lift more than 20 pounds for the duration of her pregnancy. And when the company refused to temporarily assign her a lighter duty, she took unpaid leave and she sued UPS. Last month, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in a case now known as Young v. UPS and found that a lower court ruling had used the wrong standard to decide whether the company had discriminated against its employee. So Peggy Young is given another chance to prove that she had been a victim of discrimination because she was pregnant. But the fact remains that, as Senator Casey himself has said, while the court's decision is a victory for Peggy Young, it still leaves too much uncertainty for other pregnant workers who still face significant challenges under the decision. And as he has done throughout his career, first as Pennsylvania's Auditor General, and then as a state treasurer, and now as U.S. Senator, Bob Casey has put his words into action. With his colleagues in the Senate and in the House, he introduced the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, to ensure that all workers with medical needs arising out of pregnancy have a right to accommodation. And if you go onto the RAC's website, you can click on our action alert and make sure that your senators and representatives know about and support this legislation. But Senator Casey's areas of expertise extend much further. He's a member of the Senate Committees on Finance, on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, which is one committee, Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, the Special Committee on Aging, and the Joint Economic Committee. He's a former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee overseeing the Middle East, and he has taken a particular interest in ensuring that Iran's nuclear ambitions are curtailed through strong and effective economic sanctions. Senator Casey also shepherded into law the ABLE Act, which removed unfair rules that didn't allow Americans with disabilities to save for their future without losing their eligibility for essential government programs. So thanks to Senator Casey, the ABLE Act, which is now law, means families that have a child with a disability will be allowed to save for their long-term care. Senator Casey's commitment to strengthening the well-being of his constituents and indeed all Americans is a reflection of what it truly means to be a public servant. Please welcome Senator Bob Casey.
Thanks so much. I wish every introduction was like that. Well, thank you very much. I'm honored to be here, and I know that we have limited time, so I wanted to maybe cover one major topic and then open it up for questions. But I'm grateful to be here because we don't have a chance enough in this city and this place called the Capitol to talk to folks and to engage in a conversation where there's a combination of a focus on public policy and results for folks across the country, as well as talking about how that work and how that advocacy can be inspired by faith or any faith tradition. So it's especially noteworthy that you're here today, and I want to commend the work. I guess, can I use the acronym RAC?
Yes.
That's pretty cool to have an acronym around here. In Washington, if you don't have an acronym, you kind of don't matter. Everything has to have an acronym. If you listen to someone from Washington long enough, they can speak in entire paragraphs with two things, acronyms and once in a while a verb. Usually not an adjective, but acronyms and verbs. So I'll try not to do that. But I'm grateful for the work that's done by so many people here. Now, I don't want to offend anyone, but how many people here are from Pennsylvania? If you can put your hand up. That's great. So every question will be to those individuals. No, I'm not kidding. I did want to expand on the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act in Peggy Young's case. I was fortunate that as we were pushing to get more support for the act, and I'm going to talk about the act itself in a moment, but I was fortunate that as we were really into a phase where we were trying to push it harder, that her case was before the court. It gave it a special momentum, a unique momentum, I should say. It's not very often when your bill is the subject of, pretty much the subject of a Supreme Court argument. So it gave me my only chance to stand in front of the Supreme Court and give a very brief speech. My law school classmates would be really concerned that I was there instead of a lot of them, but I got there because I was a public official, not because I was a brilliant lawyer. But it did give, I think, the nation a chance to examine this issue, which seems so fundamental, even self-evident, you might say, that when a woman is in the workforce and she becomes pregnant, how does that employer handle that? That seems a pretty simple recitation of what the circumstances are. And a lot of employers do the right thing. They come up with ways to make sure that she can do her work and get through her pregnancy at the same time. And I think, unfortunately, we have too many employers who don't get it right. The good news is, when we put forth the legislation, it wasn't just that we came up with some grand design to remedy this problem. We actually had a standard from 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act, signed by a Republican president, the first President Bush, advocated strongly by then Attorney General Thornburg, a Pennsylvanian, who had a great commitment to folks with disabilities, and passed overwhelmingly. I should memorize the vote number, but it was a big vote. And in that Americans with Disabilities Act, I should say the act itself, we have this new concept, reasonable accommodations, right? It doesn't say any accommodation that the employee dreams up, any demand that he or she would insist upon because they have a disability. It was reasonable accommodations. So what is reasonable in one setting might be unreasonable in another. And that would be true whether you're looking at it from the vantage point of the employee or the employer. The unfortunate circumstance with regard to pregnancy is we had a Pregnancy Discrimination Act in effect in 1990, passed in 1978, but it didn't have those two magic words, which have meaning now in the law. So what we're trying to do, in essence, is to update that original discrimination statute, which also passed with big numbers. So you'd think that'd be a pretty easy assignment, right? Only in Washington would that get complicated. But I think it's important that we have a standard upon which to build a good set of public policy or policies around it. What I'm hoping is that because of Peggy's case, and it was a win, but not a slam dunk kind of a win. It was a good win, but there's still uncertainty about how all this should work, or at least some uncertainty about what employers might be required to do. And it's sent back because of the Supreme Court case, sent back to the lower court. So it's not the perfect result that she prevailed, but not in the way that I would have hoped. You always want a complete victory, no matter what the circumstance. But it did give the issue great attention. So what I'm hoping is, because of her courage and her willingness to take this all the way to the Supreme Court and back, in a sense, now that it's going back to the lower court, and our legislation, as well as something that happened in the budget debates we had a couple weeks ago, that combination of actions or news would lead a lot of employers to say, you know what, I haven't thought about this, or we haven't necessarily gotten it right. We're going to, as a company, we're going to get this right, and we're not going to wait for some law to tell us how we have to get it right. So that's my hope, and that's not a naive hope. I think there are plenty of employers that will do that. I can't quantify that, but I'm sure many of them will. But for those who don't want to do that, I think we need to figure out a way to make the law work. Now, I had a budget amendment that, and if you know anything about the budget process, it's a rather strange process, with all due respect to the federal government. I came from state government, and in state government you have a the governor of the state, at least in Pennsylvania, but it's true I think of other states, the governor proposes a budget, and in the budget you have both a combination of policy and money, right? You've got policy and departments, departmental programs, and you have the appropriations requests that the governor makes to fund all of that, I'll call it policy for shorthand. In the federal government, we make it much more complicated. We have, in a sense, three baskets. And I'm probably not being technically accurate here, but this is my way of understanding it. You have an authorization process which authorizes the policy. That's a whole set of hearings and work. Then you have appropriations, how you fund all that. That's separate. That's a separate committee. So you have authorizing committees over here, and then the appropriations committee over there. But then there's this third process called, I call it the budget process, where the United States Senate and the House has a long debate about the federal budget. Except despite all of that debate and all of the work that goes into that, there's even a committee called the Budget Committee. And all the votes that take place before we left for our break a couple of weeks ago, I'm forgetting the date, but it'll come to me later, but I'm sure you watched it for about 15 hours of debates. It was thrilling. Votes on budget amendments. If you really have no life, you would have been watching. But all of that leads to a result, which is a vote on a budget resolution, which has no force and effect of law. So you do all that. So in essence, it becomes an opportunity to highlight issues. And it does give a broad outline for spending going forward, but it doesn't have the legal effect of an appropriations vote, for example. So what senators in both parties try to do, I haven't seen the House process up close, but we try to work on some amendments and try to limit them so that people aren't here for 6 days of votes. But the amendment that I actually got a vote on in the process was a budget amendment version of the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. So it's not a replica of the bill, but it basically says, and I don't have it in front of me, but basically says this is what this budget amendment is about. This is what the problem is, and we think this is what the solution should be. That employers should make sure that there are reasonable accommodations for pregnant workers, and that this should be part of the policy in the United States. So we put that forward, and I was told by people in both parties that we should have a vote on it because Senator Enzi, who's chairman of the Budget Committee, now in the control of the Republican Party, Chairman Enzi said, I think we would take a voice vote on this and move on. And it was early enough in the evening where I could be a little bit obnoxious and say, it wasn't 2 a.m., it was about 7:30, and I could say, no, I want to vote. And people in both parties looked at me and said, why do you want to vote? We just said we would accept it. And something inside me said, let's get everybody on the record on this. Because I actually thought that if we had a vote, that just like the bill in the House and the Senate, we would get overwhelming Democratic support, but not a lot of Republican support. So I wanted to kind of explore that and expose where our gaps were. Now I thought if I got all the Democrats, I would get a segment of Republicans because it should be a pretty easy vote, right? But I didn't think I would get the kind of support we got. Well, long story short is we had a vote and it was 100-0. Now I've been here. Now, I'd like to be able to tell you that every time I propose something it's 100-0, but that doesn't happen very often. So what it did was it was a breakthrough in a sense that prior to that we didn't have a single Republican as a co-sponsor on the bill. I don't think we're going to have every Republican as a co-sponsor of the bill itself, because some will say, oh, well, that was a budget amendment, it wasn't exactly the same, and I was expressing support for pregnant workers, but not really, because in the bill, I mean, there'll be a lot of reasons why they won't all support it. But I do think it was a breakthrough, and right after the vote, and I have to keep this name confidential because I'll get them in big trouble, but right after the vote, Senator Shaheen and I, Jean Shaheen from New Hampshire, she and I have been working on the bill together. were kind of tracked down by this Republican senator who said, I just gave away that he's a he, but he said, I want to talk to you about that. I want to work with you on this. He said, I had a cousin, and then he recited a brief story about his cousin, how he thought she was, or it was, either he thought or it was documented that she was discriminated against in the workplace when she was pregnant. So that was a pretty good night, and we were able to kind of open a new front in this battle to get more people to support it. So we're going to keep working, but there's nothing more valuable than having individuals like you contact your member of Congress, House and Senate, and say, please support this simple but important bill. Just to give you an example, where's Sarah? Sarah, I want to make sure I get this right. She wrote it down for me, so I should read it. The 96,000 number, here it is. If you consider that in a state like Pennsylvania, here's what the numbers are. The majority of all births, over 96,000 a year, are to women in the workforce. So the majority of births in our state are to women who are in the workforce. That may not have been the case 40, 50 years ago, but it is the case today. So we're going to make sure that we continue not just to fight hard for this, but also to do everything we can to get as much support as we can. Because there's no reason why we can't accommodate both. Meaning, and I'm not just using that word accommodations again, but really to do both. To say to women, we know that you're not in the workforce because you just like to work. Most women are in the workforce because they have to work. So because of that circumstance and that challenge, we want to make sure that you don't feel as if you're not going to be able to do both. And I can't even imagine the stress of performing well on the job, and then the added stress of a pregnancy, and then a third kind of stress, which is the discrimination. I can't even imagine that. Something as simple as a bathroom break, or some simple accommodation that two human beings, employee and employer, or even more than 2 or 3 people can work out. There's just no excuse for not getting this right. And we've got a lot of folks in both parties that give a lot of speeches about how they stand up for families, and they really think families are important. And it's, when a child is born, isn't that wonderful? Well, we could make it a lot more wonderful if that mom was not under stress, so that if she wants to, she can have a good pregnancy and perform on the job, have the child, and maybe take some time, and then go back into the workforce. But we don't need layers and layers and layers of stress in the life of a pregnant worker. So this isn't hard, and we just need folks to recognize that. And I'm just not going to be very patient with employer excuses about, if it's so hard, then why aren't you out there protesting the ADA from 1990? It's a quarter century of policy on the ADA. So if it's the right thing to do, as it is in the context of Americans with disabilities, it's also the right thing to do in the context of Americans who are in the workforce and happen to become pregnant. So I'll stop there, but I do want to say how much I appreciate the fact that you bring the intensity and the commitment to faith into public policy. A lot of people say to me, I'm a Catholic, right? They say to me, well, how do you handle that? How do you you get your faith over here and you got policy and all that? It's very simple for me. And I'm sure this is true of most people in the room, or a lot of folks in this room, is that faith, in my judgment, can never dictate a result. But your faith can inspire you, as it does me. It can inform you, but it can also enrich your life. And you don't become a robot when you're a public official. You don't leave all of your inspirations and all of your passions somewhere else. So I think it's important that we, as long as we get that distinction right about no dictation but inspiration, I think so many faith traditions in this town help us to make better policy. And I'm just grateful that you're willing to bring your passions on public policy all the way to Washington. So let's take some questions, even from non-Pennsylvanians. Felice, how are you? Oh. Felice Rena from Montgomery County. Felice, we have free candy in our office. You get free candy because you're in the first row.
And it's so great to see you. It's so great. Is it on?
Guess you have to hold it really close. Don't hear it yet.
Well, I'll talk now. Can everybody hear me? No. Okay, well,
Or you can use one of these, maybe.
how are you? It's good to see you. Now can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Bob Casey
I can't
is...
believe I figured that out. No. My wife would be amazed.
Give her my best, will you please?
I will.
Bob Casey is a wonderful senator from Pennsylvania. He's our main senator. That's very important. And he does very good work. And this bill that you brought up and signed on for this woman, Peggy, terrific. And continue good luck in your job and everything else. And thank you.
Please, thank you. We didn't practice this, by the way.
No, we didn't. Thanks.
Thanks, Felice.
Sure.
Yes, ma'am. All right.
And one of the issues that we're all concerned about as Jews and progressive Jews is Iran and what's happening.
Right.
Wanted to do a little bit about it, but also express our support for the current legislation with no amendments and I think it's an important part of the process.
Yeah, I have been, about Iran generally, but in particular the current legislation that we're debating this week. I have been among the more aggressive senators on these issues over a long period of time. In terms of leading the way on sanctions, there might be 5 others who have done more, or 7 or 8 others who have done about the same amount, but I'm in the top 10 probably. And I'm glad I was, because I think it helped get to a result. And I think the Congress should pat itself on the back for getting those sanctions in place over many years. People in both parties can take credit. What some in Congress don't do is give credit to the administration, which implemented the sanctions, because even if you say to the world, we're going to have sanctions, you should join us, that doesn't mean they just line up behind you. It meant that President Obama and his team, especially Secretary Clinton, because she was there for most of the implementation of these. And I think probably, and if I go back a little bit, probably Secretary Rice as well when President Bush was in office. But you had to have a concerted effort to get the entire world, the international community to back you on sanctions, because they wouldn't have been effective if it were just our sanctions. So Congress should pat ourselves on the back. We should also pat others on the back and say, sanctions brought people to the table. That's number one. Number two is we have the parameters of a deal, but they are only parameters. Now, they're more detailed than a lot of people would have expected. In fact, I think a lot of people were pleasantly surprised there was as much detail. For example, I didn't expect to read that they're at the 3 point, I think it's 6.7, but 3.67% enriched, kind of lower enriched uranium. The quantity they have now is 10,000 kilograms. Under the agreement, if it went into effect, that 10,000 would go down to 300 kilograms. That's just one kind of detail. I didn't expect them to have as much detail on inspecting from the mining of the uranium. The surveillance of that will be 25 years. Now, others are 15-year requirements, others are 10. So there's a level of detail which is surprising. But They are but parameters, and they fill not quite 4 pages, okay? The real agreement will be, I don't know how many pages, probably hundreds of pages, then backed up by annexes, kind of like in a book when you have addendums to a book, that will be, a lot of it will be classified. So there's going to be a lot of detailed reading to do when they actually have a deal. So I'm in the process now of just trying to better understand what those 4 pages mean by getting classified briefings from the CIA and from other, and by the way, every member of Congress has to do this on our own. It's not like they have it set up for you. You've got to seek out the briefings if you want to do your job right, and I think I have an obligation to get this right. Probably the most complicated foreign policy decision I will ever make, and that's true of others who are here as well. So I'm going through that process now and trying to learn more as best I can. That will be amplified when you have an actual agreement. The bill you're talking about, so I want to get to the bill. We had a vote in the Foreign Relations Committee, as you might know. I used to be on the committee, I'm no longer, I'm missing not being there, but I was on 6 years. But they voted 19-0 to support the so-called Corker bill that allows Congress to have a role to play. The good news is, even though we're probably going to have a titanic debate or collision when there is an agreement, if they get to a final agreement, the time for that is then, when you have an actual agreement. We should not have a constitutional collision between the executive and legislative branch over this one bill. Fortunately, based upon that vote, I think we're very close to averting that. Here's the problem. We've got a bill on the floor that vote was 19-0 in the committee. It means people in both parties supported it overwhelmingly. And the president, after a lot of back and forth, said, I will sign that bill. But here's what's going to happen this week. You're going to have folks that are going to try to add amendments to it to take it down. Now, I'm being blunt about that. I think there are some people, I don't know who they are, some members, some senators, who think that if their amendment passes, it will improve the legislation. I want to be honest with you. I think there are very few, if any, who really believe that their amendment will make it better. I think, unfortunately, there's folks who want to bring it down. A bill that passed 19-0 after months of hard work. So I would hope that we could not change it, get it passed, and then move on, and people want to yell and scream and fight and vote against the final deal, that's fine. But let's not have a titanic collision right now. It would be bad for us, it would be bad for this process, and I think it'd be bad for the Middle East as well. So, because we still have a lot of work to do to closely examine the final agreement. And this is one of those things where the margin for error has to be as low as humanly possible. We have to get this right. And I'm already hearing from people who have already made up their mind. I'm thinking, how can you make your mind up when you've read 4 pages of a summary of something that could potentially be thousands of pages long? So we need to, members like me, need to study and listen and study and listen for a long time before making a decision. But I do think in the end that the bill is helpful because it does give us a role that's appropriate. And I just hope we can get through this week and get this done and then move on to the harder question, which is the ultimate agreement. Sorry for that long answer, but it's complicated. Okay, I'm getting the hook, I'm sorry.
Also from Pennsylvania.
Yes, where are you from?
Pennsylvania. I'm in the 16th district in Reading.
You're in Reading, okay.
Right. So my House representative is not someone who generally agrees with what I would like to see the country do. And our other senator, unfortunately, is not of the same mindset as you either. So since you're the insider, what would you suggest would be our best approach to try to get them to study more carefully and try to vote what would be morally the right thing to do in the climate bill, the Family Act, and this one?
Yeah. Well, I think that I think members of Congress are much more influenced by what you say to them than by what I say to them, frankly. Once in a while, we hope that collaboration here can shed some light on something and maybe even change someone's mind. But my experience is that folks are more responsive to the points that you make to them. So I would continue to do that, number one. And number two, I think that one of the problems with this town right now is that you have a lot of categorical statements. And I've done this too. I'm guilty of it as well. I try not to, but that people make judgments about a whole issue or what the policy is or what the administration is doing in very categorical ways. That the administration is always wrong on everything. Other than that, we're open-minded to their opportunities, right? But so I would hope that when it comes to some of these issues, that that folks would be less categorical and urge them to do it. The climate issue, and I know we don't have time to discuss it at length, but I think that the most important element of that whole debate, in terms of policy and what we'll actually vote on, is the so-called Clean Power Plan by the EPA. And I've written to the EPA saying, I support what you're trying to do. I was very clear in that, saying that I support what they're trying to do. But I was critical of how they came up with Pennsylvania's share of the energy efficiency part of it. For example, they said you have to come up with 8 times more energy efficiency to meet the overall goal of reducing carbon. And I thought, we're not going to be able to do that. That's unreasonable. And we're working with them to try to make that more reasonable, and they've been open to making that kind of an adjustment. So we can be critical without saying, you're wrong about everything. So I do think the more that you can make that point about being less categorical is very important. But I know, because we have 2 hearings starting, one started 10 minutes ago and one that's starting about now, I have to go. But they're both in this building, and if you want to sit in the hearing room for a while, you're welcome. But I'm really grateful for the time, and I know we don't have much time, but if there's a way to interact with folks, if they have other questions or they want to get them to us, we'd love to get a response for you. Thanks very much, everyone. Appreciate it.